It had been an amazing day. Jesus had taught a huge crowd of people about God's love, healed many who were sick, and even performed a giant miracle, feeding more than 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. The disciples had helped hand out the food and watched in awe as it never ran out. Everyone was amazed and full. The sun was starting to go down, and the crowd was slowly beginning to leave. Jesus turned to his disciples and said,
"You've worked hard today. Now I want you to get in the boat and go across the lake. I'll meet you on the other side."
The disciples were surprised that Jesus wasn't coming right away, but they obeyed. They climbed into the boat, pushed off from shore, and began rowing into the evening waters of the Sea of Galilee. As the disciples rowed away, Jesus turned and walked up a nearby mountain. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, orange, pink, and purple. Jesus found a quiet place where he could be alone. He knelt down and began to pray. He talked to his Father in heaven about the day, about the people, and especially about his disciples. He loved them very much and wanted them to grow strong in their faith. Jesus stayed on the mountain for a long time, praying and listening. Even though he was far from the boat, he could still see the disciples from where he sat. The stars began to come out, and night quietly fell across the lake. The wind began to pick up. Out on the lake, the disciples were having a hard time. The wind was blowing harder now, and waves were starting to rise. Their small boat rocked and tipped, and the sail flapped wildly in the wind. They tried to row, but it felt like they weren't getting anywhere. The sky grew darker, and clouds covered the moon. Rain started to fall, and the waves splashed over the sides of the boat. The disciples were tired, wet, and scared. They looked at each other nervously.
"Where is Jesus?"
One of them asked.
"Why did he send us out here alone?"
Another whispered. Even though they had seen Jesus do amazing miracles, they were afraid of the storm. It felt like they were all alone. Back on the mountain, Jesus was not asleep. Even though it was late at night, he was watching. Jesus saw the wind, the waves, and the boat struggling far below. He knew the disciples were afraid. He knew exactly what was happening. Jesus loved them too much to leave them alone in the storm. So, in the middle of the night, he stood up. He didn't call for another boat. He didn't wait for the storm to end. Jesus did something amazing. He stepped out onto the water. That's right, he walked on the water. Step by step, Jesus moved across the stormy sea, heading straight for his disciples. The disciples were still fighting the storm when suddenly, one of them pointed out into the darkness. "What is that?" he shouted over the wind. They all looked. Something, or someone, was walking toward them on top of the water. The waves crashed, the wind howled, and yet this figure kept coming closer. "It's a ghost!" someone cried out in fear. The disciples huddled together, terrified. They had never seen anything like this before. They didn't know it was Jesus. Their fear grew stronger. They thought something bad was coming for them. But then, a voice rang out clearly over the storm, a voice they knew.
"Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid."
The disciples froze. That voice, it was Jesus. He was walking on the water, coming right toward them. The fear in their hearts started to melt. Jesus wasn't far away anymore. He was right there with them, even in the middle of the storm. The disciples stared in amazement. The waves were still wild, and the wind was still blowing, but somehow it felt a little less scary now. Jesus was with them. He hadn't forgotten them. He had come to them in the middle of their trouble. They didn't know what he would do next, but they knew they weren't alone anymore. Peter stood up in the boat, his eyes wide, and said,
"Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you on the water."
The other disciples gasped. Walk on water? That sounded impossible. But Jesus looked at Peter and said just one word, "Come." Peter took a deep breath, held on to the edge of the boat, and stepped out. His foot touched the water, and it held him up. Then his other foot joined, and Peter was walking on water, just like Jesus. Step by step, he moved toward Jesus. His eyes were locked on his Lord, full of wonder and faith. But then, Peter looked around. The wind was still blowing hard. The waves were still crashing. Fear crept back into his heart. He took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the storm. Suddenly, Peter began to sink. The water rose up around his knees, then his waist. "Lord, save me!" he cried, arms reaching up. He was sinking fast. The fear had taken over. But even though Peter had doubted, Jesus hadn't moved. He was right there. Without hesitation, Jesus reached out his hand and grabbed Peter, lifting him up. Jesus held Peter firmly and gently.
You have little faith.
Jesus said, not angry but kind. "Why did you doubt?" He helped Peter walk back to the boat. Peter's heart was racing, but he was safe in Jesus' grip. The wind was still wild, but Peter wasn't afraid now. He had learned something important. When he kept his eyes on Jesus, he could do impossible things. But when he focused on the storm, he began to sink. Still, Jesus had come for him. Jesus hadn't let him drown. His love was stronger than any storm. As soon as Jesus and Peter climbed back into the boat, something incredible happened. The wind stopped. The waves calmed down. The rain ended. Everything became perfectly still. The disciples looked around in amazement. One moment there had been a storm, and now peace. It was as if the sea itself listened to Jesus. The boat floated gently on the calm water. No more fear. No more danger. Just quiet peace. The disciples realized this was no ordinary man. Only God could command the wind and the waves like that. The disciples fell down on their knees right there in the boat. They worshipped Jesus, their hearts full of awe and wonder. "Truly you are the Son of God," they said. They had seen miracles before, but nothing like this. Jesus had walked on water. He had rescued Peter. He had calmed the storm. And most of all, he had come to them in their moment of fear. They would never forget that night. Their faith had grown, and their love for Jesus was deeper than ever. The next morning, the boat reached the other side of the lake. The sun was rising, and everything looked fresh and new. The disciples stepped onto the shore with a new sense of purpose. They had seen Jesus' power and love in a whole new way. As they walked together, they talked about what had happened. "I'll never forget how he grabbed my hand," Peter said. "Even when I was scared," another added. "He came to us." Their hearts were full, and they knew Jesus would always be with them, no matter what storms came. This story isn't just about a storm on a lake long ago. It's about the storms in our lives today, times when we're scared, when things are hard, or when we feel alone. But just like the disciples, we are never really alone. Jesus sees us. He comes to us. He speaks peace to our hearts. And when we feel like we're sinking, all we have to do is cry out, "Lord, save me," and He will reach out His hand. His love is stronger than the storm. Let's remember Jesus' comforting words. Can you say this with me? "Be of good cheer. It is I. Don't be afraid." Matthew 14 verse 27. Isn't that a wonderful promise? When you feel afraid, remember those words. Jesus is near. He's bigger than any storm, and He wants us to trust Him. Thanks for joining us for this powerful Bible story. Remember, Jesus is our Savior, our helper, and our friend. Just like He came to the disciples, He comes to us too, with peace, power, and love. No matter what storm you face, keep your eyes on Him. And never forget, Jesus is always with you. See you next time, and God bless you.